Good evening. My name is Tom Giroux, and I'm with the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. And I have Becky Gaskill, who's my coworker at the Forest History Association. I'd like to welcome you to this Zoom presentation tonight. First, a little shameless advertising about the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. You can see here our mission to inform, educate, archive, and publish. Encourage you to go to our website and learn more about our organization. And then if you click up here in the right-hand side, you can take a look at our membership page. It's really easy to join and support our work in educating the public about the history of Wisconsin. You can see the membership categories over here on the right. You can donate online or make your membership online, or you can print and mail it with an old-fashioned check. So I'd really encourage you to consider joining the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. It's a great organization. We have every year in the fall a conference where we do lots of interesting things. So tonight on our schedule, we have Dick Thiel, and Dick is an actual member of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin, and he's been a longtime member. But also, he led the Wisconsin Timber Wolf Recovery Project from 1980 to 1989, helped draft the state's Wolf Recovery Management Plan, and remains active in wolf educations. He's authored several books on wolves and conducts annual ecology workshops through the Timberwolf Alliance, Timberwolf Information Network, advocating for the understanding of this often misunderstood predator. A little bit about our webinar. We will be handling the Q&A through the chat function, which I'll be enabling here in a minute. And so if you have questions, go ahead and enter them as you think of them in the chat function. And usually that's on the bottom of your screen, but depending on the device you have, it might be at the top of the screen. And the way to find it is just to kind of mouse around. Eventually it'll pop up. The only other thing I wanted to mention tonight is wolves can be a controversial subject, and we want to encourage people to be respectful to one another and different opinions about it. There's a wide variety of opinions about wolves, and we just want everybody in the chat to respect and think about what you're typing before you do it. So very appreciative, Dick, for you to be here. Becky and I are going to go on mute and let you take it away from here.
All right. I assume everyone can hear me, and I thank you for the opportunity to give this presentation. I belong to the International Wolf Center. I'm on a board of director there, and I also am a very active person with Timberwolf Information Network, which they both share the same mission, which is not an advocacy group espousing certain things for wolves. It's just organizations that their entire missions are education. We use science-based information. And this slide here shows you how to get hooked up on their web pages and stuff. So we'll get going. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about a bunch of things with regards to wolves. First off, some of the individual animal itself, what it is, and how science looks at it. And then we're going to get involved into some of the things that it's predation and how that works. And we will talk about management as well. It's a rather interesting species as a predator goes, because most predators prey on animals that are smaller than themselves. There's only a few that actually take on the huge challenge of preying on animals that are actually larger than themselves. So we're going to describe wolves real quickly. They are the largest member of the wild dogs that are out there. Obviously, the Canis familiaris, the dog, can be much, much smaller than wolves and much, much larger in some cases, depending upon the breed. In Wisconsin, wolves weigh somewhere between 50 and 100 pounds. And most adult wolves, and they're not adult till they're 2 years of age, females may be somewhere around 65 to 70 pounds on average, and the males will probably be somewhere around 70 to 90 pounds. Um, they are a rather interesting animal in terms of design. They have a very narrow keel-like chest with their elbows actually turned in. This allows them to be able to kind of move like a tornado through the brush. And they can do that with speed because they typically will walk at about a pace of about 5 miles an hour, and they certainly can run up to 40 miles an hour. The other thing about this animal is that, unlike, say, for instance, a cheetah, which can do bursts of speed, wolves can sustain fast movement for hours on end. So these guys are built strong, and they are what we call coursers. They're animals or predators that have to keep moving constantly, searching for prey. They're not an ambush predator where they sit and wait for something to come by. They're actually actively moving around. There's a Russian fable that says the wolf is kept fed by its feet, and it's absolutely true. The wolf's world is not uh, sensed through its eyes like you and I humans. They have a superb sense of smell, and that smell is incredibly difficult for us scientists to try and measure. But in any event, like the common dog, these animals are very well equipped to smell things, and in all probability, in some cases, they're able to detect prey not only from a distance, but they're probably able to detect prey that actually may be injured or may be diseased or may be sick, and that's all done through the nose. That's not to say that their eyesight is poor. It's as good as yours and mine almost. They don't see this colors as vividly as we primates do, but they can certainly detect that. And their ability to detect movement with their eyes is incredible. They also have really, really good hearing, which is probably just slightly better than ours. Again, these animals are well equipped in the environments they inhabit, and they are able to do business because that's how they have evolved over the millennia. Just to back out of wolves for a second, there are three different types of large predators in North America. There are, and their style of doing business differs depending upon what's going on. So I'm going to describe, some of these differences because I think that's really important for people to comprehend because wolves are very different from the bears, which we call the ursids, and from the cats, which we call the felids. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about a black bear or a grizzly bear or a bobcat or a mountain lion. We're talking about the ursids, the felids, and then, of course, the canids. With regards to feeding strategies, the bears alone are omnivores. That means they eat both plants and animals. Felids, the cats, tend to be much more strictly meat eaters. Wolves are technically meat eaters or carnivores, but they do eat plants, and they don't rely on it, but they can not only eat them, but they can gain nutrition from them. One of the big differences between wolves and a lot of mammals, in fact, most predators in Wisconsin, whether it tends to be a skunk or a bear, is that they have a reproductive strategy that's called monogamous. They mate one-on-one, and they are very familial oriented. So they are different from most animals because of the fact that in most mammals, the male can sire many females. And as a consequence of these two different reproductive strategies, a lot of the other stuff falls into place. Territoriality, for instance, all animals inhabit space, and we usually call those home ranges. And a difference between a territory and a home range is the only difference really is behaviorally. Whereas in most animals, like a white-tailed deer, they occupy a home range. A wolf, on the other hand, occupies a territory, and that means they defend their space against others of their own kind. And so, if you are a bear, you have what we call gender specific territories, meaning male bears will not overlap much with other male bears. And the same thing with the cats. But with regards to wolves, it's the male and the female. They occupy a space together. They mutually defend that territory because they are familial. And that is a huge difference with a lot of the mammals and specifically with a lot of the predators. In terms of aggressiveness, because of that angst that goes with being, polygynous or mating with many females, you see most aggressiveness focused on male to male in the bear family and in the cat family. Whereas with regards to wolves, because this is a family-based situation, those kinds of altercations are familial. With regards to predator style, I've already somewhat introduced this. Ursids are coursers, just like the wolves. They're walking around actively seeking out food, whereas the felids are notorious as ambushers. And so you have to kind of put together all of these strategies and look at the differences and the similarities. And there are, each of these three groups share a few attributes and some differences, but wolves are somewhat unusual because of the fact, especially because of the fact that they're monogamous. Now, before I turn the page on this, that doesn't mean that monogamy in the sense of the human condition, where there is one male that mates with a female, and if one of the two dies, it pines away. I have seen, because of my work with wolves in Wisconsin, I have seen what I would call the equivalent of divorce. I have seen dating games that have gone awry. So all of the dynamics of an incredibly social animal, like we have with wolves, is also something that we see amongst humans. And so it's probably one reason why their common ancestor with the dog, probably, as the two diverged, dogs fit so well into the human family situation. Fuel economy for wolves, as I mentioned earlier, is big. The smallest hoofed mammal that they prey on in North America is the white-tailed deer. The largest is the bison. And this is what their diet consists of. They're not known to basically survive off of small things. They do supplement their diet with beaver, snowshoe hares, and a whole host of other things, fish, whatever. But in any event, what their focus is primarily is what we call the ungulates, the animals that have hoofs at the end of their legs, and this is what they prefer. So we're going to look at predation now, and we're going to discuss some things from the eyesight of the eyes of or the views of an ecologist. When predation is being studied, and incidentally, some of the first objective scientific studies on predation were actually conducted here in Wisconsin by a guy by the name of Paul Arrington, bobwhite quail versus great horned owls and red-tailed hawks in the 1930s out of the University of Wisconsin. And he became a predator biologist at the University of Iowa for the remainder of his career. But I mean, there's a pretty healthy history of these kinds of approaches. And Wisconsin was in the vanguard of that many, many, many decades ago. So the questions that we would ask to try and get at the nuts and bolts of what impacts do, in this specific case, what do wolves' impact on deer have, we have to ask a bunch of questions. Number one, is the prey that they're seeking, is it available? Second question we'd have to ask is, are they actually vulnerable? They may be available, but if they're not vulnerable, they're just not catchable. And so you can see how these are gates that wolves have to go through in order to get dinner. And then the last thing, because these animals that they seek are actually physically larger than themselves, there's actually a risk in engaging that prey to pull it down so that they can actually make a supper out of it. And so that is something that wolves have to actually think about as they're coursing through their respective territories. They're certainly going to encounter prey. When they make that encounter, they have to figure out whether it's vulnerable. And then they also have to figure out how risky is the business of trying to get this animal. Down below on that chart there, I threw in wolf diet. In the previous slide, I had said that ungulates are their favorite diet. And in Wisconsin, we've had several studies that have done, and they're very basic studies. There's much more sophisticated stuff, but that costs lots of money. We've looked at scats, scat remains, prey in the scats of wolves. The first study was done in Wisconsin in the 1940s. We had one done in the 1980s, and more recently, with Timberwolf Information Network, we did a study here in the Central Forest of Wisconsin, just looking at summer diet. But in any event, you can kind of see by season there how deer factor into it. So there's absolutely no question that deer are their primary prey. Beaver factor in fairly decently both in the spring and in the fall. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, beaver are usually, bar climate change, they're locked underneath the ice for a good portion of the winter. And in the spring of the year, when the ice starts breaking up, number one, they're probably sick of eating that rotting bark underneath the ice in their food caches. And secondly, they need to stretch their legs. So they're getting out of those streams and trying to get fresh trees to cut and eat the cambium layer. And then, of course, in the fall of the year, they're actually building those food caches for the upcoming winter. And so they are actually spending a lot of time foraging off the banks of the streams. And that makes them available and it makes them vulnerable. And the wolves capitalize on that. And of course, there are other creatures that are out there that wolves opportunistically will take. But as you can see from that chart, I mean, there's absolutely no question that deer are the number one. So we have to look at deer. What makes them vulnerable? And we do know a lot about this. There's been a lot of physiological studies that have been done specifically in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and in Ontario in recent decades. And I'm pulling this graph from a study that was done way back in the 70s by George Kalinowski in Ontario. And it's just a nice graph to show, but I could show you stuff from Wisconsin, from Michigan, Minnesota. It all says the same thing. But what we have learned over the decades is that as the winter progresses, deer are basically slowly burning up their fat reserves because the intake that they have in foraging on a daily basis in winter does not meet their daily metabolic needs. In other words, they're deficient. And what they're banking on is fat reserves, which they built up during the autumn of the year. The problem, of course, is that fat reserves are finite, and so they get burned up. And if that winter drags on, the fat reserves become depleted. Now, the question is, where is the fat in a body of a deer? And are all the fat that are deposited in these bodies, are they depleted at the same rate, or are they is there certain parts of the body that deplete their fat first? Answer to that question is quite interesting. Indeed, they don't dissipate at the same rates. And the very last fat reserves that deer burn up is actually inside the long leg bones, the fat that is in the femur bones and the humerus bones. And so we can, as biologists, we can look at fat content and we can determine what is the depletion rate. And as you can see from this slide, when they get down to below 60% fat left in a femur, and that's the last fat left in their body, they become severely food stressed. And at that point in time, the vulnerability factor for these deer goes way up. And so in severe winters, wolves are literally taking deer left and right. In mild winters, it goes in favor of deer, where they become almost invulnerable, and the wolves have a hard time. And so there's this yin yang that goes on constantly, winter after winter, between these two species. And I can tell you, based on studies that I've done with students in the central forest of Wisconsin, where we've seen severe winters, our fawns start dropping dead somewhere around the middle of February. Whereas in mild winters, they come through it, in good shape. And so, there's a lot of variability between winters, and the wolves have to ride that as well. Now, let's look at selection of deer by wolves. This graph here kind of shows you a couple things, but in that box, I wanted to show you a lot of people, especially deer hunters, don't they don't have a good comprehension of how quick the life of a white-tailed deer is. At death, and I'm talking about a generic deer that occupies the entire state of Wisconsin, but at death, the average buck dies at about 1.75 years. In other words, a little bit less than 2 years. They sport antlers for 1 year and they're done. And that's because of the hunting pressure primarily, and that's by humans. Does can live 3 to 4 years on average. And we also know that the prime age for white-tailed deer, because they are quick-lived, is between 1 and 4 years of age. So knowing that they're really in prime, physiological shape between 1 and 4, is there any um, uh, 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 do wolves actually select for deer, or are they just basically just taking deer as they encounter them? And so, if we can get an age on a spread of ages across a herd, and we can find also wolf killed deer and age them, we can compare the two. And in Central Forest here in Wisconsin, I've been able to do that. And as you can see from that bar chart, and the box there shows you the age of 1 to 4 years of age. Where those two bars are almost equal, that means there's no selection one way or the other. But where one is higher than the other, that means there's either selection for or against that age group. And as you can see in the box, the wolves don't start really becoming selective of deer until they're 3 or 4 years of age. In other words, they're getting towards the end of their prime condition. And by the time you get out there 6 to 8 years and 9 years plus, that's what wolves are focusing on. Now, this is white-tailed deer, and we're talking Wisconsin, but I could show you stuff from elk out in Yellowstone and Idaho, and even bison in Yellowstone and Wood Buffalo National Park. And believe me, these kinds of selectivity on age groups become exceedingly profound. And that kind of reflects the fact that as animals that are prime are just untouchable because they're in prime condition. They're much larger than wolves, and they just don't want to mess with them. So, okay, let's take a look at vulnerability and fawns because that's a big issue. It's been cropping up, especially in our neighboring state of Minnesota recently. Um, and so I wanted to pull stuff again from Wisconsin Central Forest, where some of my students and I have been doing work over the last 30 years. And I just wanted to show you that upper bar there, that upper graph, shows the percent occurrence of deer fawns in wolf scats by month, June, July, and August. And you can see that as the fawns start growing, they start to become less and less vulnerable. That doesn't mean they're totally invulnerable, but there's less of them there are more of them that can actually elude wolves as they're coursing around. And so our curiosity was picked by that. And I said, well, to some of my students, well, let's take a look at um, the loss of wolf pups in our litters over those months versus the growth rates of fawns. And you can see in that bottom graph that there's what we would call an inverse relationship between the two. As the fawns gather weight, they become more invulnerable to predation. They're less vulnerable. And because of that, there is a problem for adult wolves trying to feed their pups. They can't provision that entire litter of 5 or 6 pups. And as a consequence, we start actually seeing pups dying during that or disappearing during that time period. And so there is what we call a correlation there between the two. And so as they approach autumn, that's probably the time period for wolves, at least, when deer are probably the least vulnerable. And that's also, fortunately for wolves, when beaver become vulnerable. And so they rely more on that to take up the slack. Let's talk about that risk. Adrian Weideven was a wolf biologist for about 25 or 30 years. I worked with him for a long, long time. And he sent me a letter many years ago, and I just had to use this in my presentations because it was just amazing. But in any event, just take a moment and read this. And while you're doing that, I'm going to just take a drink of water. And all of you can probably recognize where Park Falls is. That's a Wisconsin story. So take a look at those two photographs at the bottom. On the left-hand side, you're going to see a white-tailed deer. This is taken from my trail camera, a trail camera that I have. A white-tailed deer with its tail down, looking right at a wolf. Um, I would call that kind of a standoff. When I downloaded this frame and saw what was on it, I thought, oh my God, you know, this did the deer, was there contact made? And so I went out to that site and I thoroughly looked for about 3 hours in the spring of the year for any suggestion that there was any contact or a deer was actually killed, and I found nothing. And so I have to conclude based on this evidence in this picture, plus the lack of any supporting evidence on the ground, that this deer just wasn't going to become dinner that night. And that wolf, if you can see it, looks like, yeah, probably going to just ignore you, even though I have encountered you. On the right-hand side is the skull of a wolf from a radio-collared wolf that Dave Meach, the eminent wolf biologist in Minnesota, took a picture of. And the cranium on that wolf has been collapsed, and it's in the shape of the tip of a deer hoof. And so, is there risk involved even in preying on a diminutive small ungulate such as deer? And the answer is, yeah, we have evidence, and it's even supported anecdotally by people such as Jim Hines, the logger, that these kinds of situations actually do exist. And so we have to conclude with regards to wolves and deer in Wisconsin that deer have to be vulnerable, they have to be available, they have to be vulnerable, and wolves are definitely assessing risk before they actually engage uh, getting an attack going. Um, I get a lot of people asking me wolf lifespans, and you'd think with a big animal like this that they'd be long-lived, and they're not. And it's been really interesting because the last probably 2 decades, wolf biologists from around mostly North America, but even in Europe, are coming up with similar stuff. You got to keep in mind, when we catch a wolf in a trap to radio collar it, in its back pocket, we don't find any birth certificates. So how do you age these guys? So we have to develop those techniques, and those techniques have been developed over the last 50 years, and I helped do some of that. But in any event, um, it's data that's slow in coming, and takes years and years. So I just wanted to throw out a couple things. Number one, right now there are two records maximum longevity in wild wolves at 15 years, and that's two individuals out of tens of hundreds of wolves that have been collared over the last 50 years. And one thing that was interesting to me is I got so many questions about Wisconsin. I just said, well, I'm going to go through my data. I'm going to look at that, and I'm going to try and figure out what it is. And nothing that I could publish because it statistically isn't worth it. But I had 30 animals that I knew the names, I knew the names. I knew the ages of. I knew the birth year, and I knew when they died. And the average lifespan amongst those 30 individuals was 2.2 years or 26 months. And that's from birth right through to when they died. And I went through the literature and I find out that in Denali National Park, um, uh, Dave Meach and Tom Meyer and company found the same exact number, that blew me away, 2.2 years. So on this bottom chart here, I'm showing other things as well. I've got the stuff from myself in Central Forest, which is the orange bar, but the yellow bar is actually taken more recently from a harvest season in Minnesota in 2000. I can't remember if it was 2012 or 13, where they actually were able to do aging of carcasses. And then also more recently, data coming out of Yellowstone. And generally speaking, in science, if those lines match up pretty decently, that means that you're on to something. And when I say that most wolves are dead by the time they're 2 years of age, I mean it. So if you look at that bar chart down there and you follow that line up to 2, and you go over to the number of wolves out of 100, there was about 55 that remained at age 2. So half of them are already dead at that point in time, and that slope just keeps going down constant. And so they're a very quick-lived animal. Those that become adult after 2 years of age, which is sexual maturity, in Wisconsin probably have only about 2 or 3 years of reproduction, and they are gone. They're dead. And so there's a high turnover rate amongst these breeding wolves in Wisconsin. So let's talk about those wolf packs and those family groups. We know a lot about it. A wolf pack is absolutely nothing more than a family. And there are nuances as to how we biologists will define them for technical reasons. But in any event, Jane Packard has done a wonderful job of looking at wild wolf packs that have been reported on in the literature and studied and, canvassed all kinds of wolf biologists over the last 50 years. And she's come up with some really interesting things. This bar chart there shows you the differences of what those mean are in the in the text on the left hand side. But the most common type of pack is actually what we call a disrupted pack, where one or both parents is currently missing. And the reason why they're missing, quite frankly, is usually because of that high turnover rate. They only live to be 4 or 5 years old. They're going to have, as adults, if they make it to 2, they're going to maybe make it another 2 or 3 years and they're done. And so there's this high turnover of breeders inside these families, if you will. And as a consequence, these things are structured like this. There are step situations, just like with humans. There are fosters. Wolves will adopt, um, pups and yearlings. And so what you look at in this cross section of this bar chart is rather interesting because this is the composition of what we see. And in the wild, especially right where I'm at, we don't have access to every wolf in the central forest inside each pack. We've never had that, but we see things anecdotally, and I have seen a lot of this stuff in the time I've studied wolves in Wisconsin. It's pretty cool. So the reproductive cycle is tied in with the seasonal movements of wolf packs. They exist in discrete territories. We'll get to that in a moment. But when the pups are born in April, they're way too small to be traveling through that territory with mom and dad. And as a consequence, they're kept in the den. And by the middle to the end of May, they're pulled out of the den and they're brought to a series of what we call rendezvous sites or home sites. It's really nothing more than a nursery area. It's probably a beaver pond or a stream, a pretty quiet, secure place. And the wolves, the adult wolves, and even the older brothers and sisters, whom we call yearlings, will move in and out of that rendezvous site like spokes on a wheel. Um, when they get to be about September, aged about 5, 6 months, those pups are big enough by now to be able to start moving somewhat nomadically with the adults throughout their respective territories. And that's when we see the pack movements transition into this kind of like, you see the pictures of, a single file row of wolves. Incidentally, those are interesting pictures, but typically when I had radioed wolves and I'd be flying over these guys, and in some rare occasions, I'd have 2 wolves radioed in a pack. Um, those animals would be single file walking in each other's tracks, but they may be out of sight from one another. They may be a half mile away from each other and yet walking on the same trail, and basically meeting up at some distant point. But that's the way wolves travel during the winter months, and it's all pack unison. It's a family, and they just course through their respective territories in that capacity. So let's talk territory. Again, as I had indicated earlier, this is a space that is defended, and with regards specifically to wolves, and this is where they partially get into big trouble with human beings in Wisconsin. Um, they are very serious about territory. A family occupies a discrete space. They defend that against other canids. And other canids include wolves, Canis lupus, coyotes, Canis latrans, and dogs, Canis familiaris. And the latter is where they can get into big trouble with humans. And there's a lot of people out there, especially the dog hound hunting community, that really doesn't like wolves because of this. Now, average territory size in Wisconsin, it depends upon where you are at. In the central forest here, we're probably looking at somewhere around 30 to 40 square miles. With regards to northern Wisconsin, you're probably looking at anywhere from 35 to 60 square miles. And again, I'm averaging, I'm generalizing. There's certainly smaller and there's certainly larger ones. But that means that in that 40 square mile territory, there's one breeding pair of wolves, maybe a couple of yearlings, and maybe a couple of pups by midwinter. And that is it. And that's what there's going to be until the next pup rearing season. So how do they maintain those territories in absentia of aggressiveness with neighboring packs? Because, it's not in your best interest to either get injured or killed in the process of defending that territory. And so wolves have evolved a communicative system that's rather interesting as well. As you all know, wolves howl. No, they don't howl to the full moon. They're not howling at it. They're howling to maintain their territory or to recognize distant pack mates, or to basically announce to neighboring territories, neighboring packs, if you will, that this space is occupied. Probably the most proficient way of managing that territory in terms of territoriality is through scent marking. And any of you that have dogs, you know what that's all about. The wolves can ID pack mates. They can ID basically your status in the pack if you were a dominant animal or a submissive animal. They can also identify your gender. They can identify whether you are in condition to breed, and they are only in condition to breed. Both sexes, by the way, are only capable of breeding during the winter months. The males don't have any viable sperm in the month of July. They're essentially sterile. So they highly coordinate, breeding activity in the month of February is usually when this is heightened and they're going to copulate, and 63 days later there will be pups. So all of this is kind of manners of communicating inside the pack and outside the pack, because if you happen to be a wolf that's wandering, you've left your natal territory and you're out there taking what I call the hike of life, you're using your nose and your ears to hear and smell if the space ahead of you is occupied by wolves. And that way you can, assess your risk of whether it's good to step into that area or go around it. And so that's how they manage themselves. Wolf populations, we're getting into the larger picture, which is what, most state and federal agencies, that's how they manage wildlife, is through populations. So wolf populations, in order to be viable or be able to, just carry on, they have to have adequate food and cover, and we've kind of covered some of that. They have to have, especially in a place as populated as Wisconsin, they have to have movement corridors that allow for gene flow. So these yearling animals and 2-year-olds, if they get out and start doing what I call the hike of life, we call them also dispersers, that they can move a distance and maybe meet up with an animal that is another single of the opposite sex, and there's enough space to wedge in and create a pack. That's how all of these dynamics work. And of course, in a place like Wisconsin, there has to be sufficient tolerance, or you're just not going to have wolves. So let's talk about those dispersers. And I could go on and on and on about these guys, and this map's just going to show you a few things. But generally speaking, these are the subadults. These are the ones that are approaching or have just passed sexual maturity. Normally, with regards to wolves, they don't travel. They travel singly. They don't travel in groups. It's just an individual thing, just like a human being. You go off to college or you go into the military, whatever. You're usually doing as an individual. You're not taking your brothers and sisters with you. They can move very quickly. Wolves can move 20 miles overnight easily as single animals. They will be doing something that we call looking for a space and a potential mate. And some of these actually move great distances. In these cases, these extremes here that you see represent what we call jump dispersers, where they move quickly. And the first time that we ever had an inkling that wolves could do this was wolf biologist by the name of Steve Fritz over in Minnesota in 1981. He had a collared wolf, and Beltrami Island, Minnesota, that moved over to almost the Alberta border in north central Saskatchewan. And we have tons of records like this since then, but he was the first to really, discover this. So this kind of dispersal is actually very excellent for outsourcing genetics. So there's, genetic diversity is really enhanced when you do something like when you have animals that are capable of doing something like this. Now, keep in mind, in a lot of places in North America, there's just too many people, and they're not successful because people happen to be their predator and they get killed in the process. So let's talk about mortality. Wolves die no matter where we study them, whether it's in Europe, in Asia, like India, or the Middle East, or Canada, Alaska, or here, right here in Wisconsin. They die at the rate of about 25% per year. That means one out of every four members in a pack next year at this time will have died. And so that is just the way it is. It's basic wolf biology. This is what populations of wolves have evolved to deal with. And that's partially, as I've already explained, a high turnover rate. Average age at death is very low. It's a quick life. It's a quick and furious life, and it's over in a few years. But in Wisconsin, majority of these animals are being killed by humans. Some of that is illegal killings. Vehicles take quite a few animals each year. When we have them delisted, and we've had that happen in the last 20 years a number of times, we are allowed by our state management plans to exercise lethal depredation control. So they're taken in that capacity when they are delisted federally. And we also have had some hunting seasons. And so humans, every year it's different, but humans are somewhere around 65-70% of the mortality of wolves is caused by humans. So what is the natural stuff? Most diseases don't really have a population effect. There's a couple that do. Two that are big are canine parvovirus. They're episodic. We haven't had any big things with canine parvo in a long time. Canine distemper typically has a minor effect when it's prevalent, but not terrible. We also have parasites. The one that's probably the most insidious is mange, and that has a population effect. And we've actually seen that in Wisconsin wolves back in the early 2000s. And then tick-borne bacterial things. Wolves kill wolves, and there's also accidents. I've had radioed wolves that have drowned. I had one out on the Petenwell flowage. Ice got a little thin in the month of March, and it went in and couldn't get out, and exhausted itself, hypothermia, and died there. And so prey is another thing that can kill and does kill wolves. So this is kind of an all-encompassing picture of it, but the takeaway here is 25% annual mortality. And with harvest management, we don't want to go above 25% mortality if you want to maintain a level population. Of course, if you prescribe a reduction of the population, then you would prescribe a hunt that could bump it up above 25, but you don't want to go too far above that. But in any event, there's a lot of good science in this stuff, and we know a lot about it, and we're still learning, of course, but that's the way it is. So here's where they live, and the current range is in yellow, and the dark green up in Minnesota on Isle Royal is where they were restricted to when I was a kid back in the 50s and 60s. So you can see there's been restoration has essentially succeeded in several geographic regions in the United States over the last 40-ish years. The upper Midwest, of course, Michigan and Wisconsin, population expanded into. No, we did not reintroduce wolves here. They all walked in with their own four paws and started reproducing. Out in the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies, it's a mix of reintroductions and what we call natural recolonization. And then, of course, the Mexican wolf has been a population that's been reintroduced from captivity because they are extinct in the wild. So let's look at the distributional change in Wisconsin during my lifetime, I guess. When I first started working with wolves in Wisconsin in the late 70s, I actually started privately just because I was interested. Bumped into a couple of packs up in Douglas County in the very northwest corner. I became the wolf biologist, and in 1980, because I had the time, I wasn't on my own clock. We had 5 packs that we discovered in 1980, and we couldn't even figure out how that Lincoln County pack got there because there was no knowledge about jump dispersals back then. And I look at that now and I go, well, it was, in all likelihood, it was probably jump dispersers that got there and managed to raise pups and start the process. But now, if you look at that right-hand map, you can see where all these packs are at. And you can also see in that red circle, that's the central forest area. And wolves were not there in 1980 at all. And in the early 1990s, we discovered them there, and it took them about 15 or 20 years to get really reestablished down there. And that's where they're at. It's pretty remote stuff, very similar to northern Wisconsin forests and a good place for the wolves. So the growth curve of wolves, let's take a look at that. And the bottom chart basically shows that central forest region, but the top chart is probably what most of you are interested in. Wolves went through a rapid growth phase for about 20 years, from about 1990 through about 2010, and they've started to level off. And they basically are, holding steady in a pattern of about somewhere around 950 to 1,200 wolves in Wisconsin now. And even our central forest wolves are doing the same thing. They're basically starting to plateau at somewhere around 140 to 150 wolves in the central forest. And so this population is probably mostly done with recolonization, and it's into a phase that we call saturation. And so, good question about whether wolves can self-regulate or they need to be controlled. Probably in Wisconsin, I would say it's a little of both. And because it's so populated, we're definitely going to, we would want the opportunity to control them. So let's talk about wolf management. Well, of course, in a perfect world, wolves never eat ungulates. They never attack livestock or pets, and they never ever attack humans. And in 23, the Wisconsin DNR came up with a new management plan for them, and it does not have a number attached to it. And I'm an adherent to that as a biologist. Working with numbers just gets to be a real headache politically. So we have other ways to gauge whether a population needs controlling, and it addresses that in that plan. And it's basically what are the wolf-related conflicts. So we're going to look at some of that stuff. So first off, let's take a little history lesson. Wolves were found throughout the state of Wisconsin. In 1839, the first bounty was established by territorial law. In 1865 by state, and it ran until 1957. In the last about 40 years of the bounty's existence, our population basically declined. In the final years, I calculated that about 60% of the wolves were being killed by humans each year. Keep in mind that above 25%, you get a population decline. So there's no wonder if you look at that graph down there that population of wolves went to extinction by 1960. So today we have wolves returned on their own from Minnesota, and we have to manage these animals. And the areas that we manage are what we call wolf-human conflict areas: depredations, competition for big game, and also human safety. And so we have to address those things, and the management plan does that. And managers, that's what they look at, analyze, and are reactive to. Most depredations in Wisconsin are of calves. In terms of livestock, we won't talk about the hounds. We'll talk about that later. And most of that occurs during the months of March through about October. About 30, on average of about 35 farms in Wisconsin each year over the last 25 years have depredation issues. They're not always the same exact farms. Those that are experiencing problems like that are what we call chronic depredation places. But you can look at that graph that's taken right out of the data from reported, livestock depredations. And keep in mind that farmers are paid for, livestock that has been verified as being killed by wolves. And the knowledge out there in the farm country is that, yeah, that compensation program exists. This data probably underrepresents it a tad bit, but I think it's fairly accurate. And you can see, like anything else that goes up, it goes down. Why it goes up, why it goes down in some cases, the nuances of that we can't, tell. But we hold steady at somewhere around 35 farms per year. Incidentally, we have somewhere over 10,000 farms in wolf country right now. And we have an average of 35 farms out of 10,000 that are experiencing these problems. Um, that's not to say that those that experience those are problems indeed, and that's why we have some of the not the non-lethal and when we have them delisted lethal interjections to help out. Let's talk about hounds and dogs for a bit. Pet dog risk is pretty low. Typically, that happens sometimes with residences, and again, it's this territorial thing, but also with especially tourism. People coming up from the south, the southern parts of Wisconsin, get up onto a nice toot track out in the Chequamegon National Forest and let their dog off leash. Animal goes running up ahead, goes around the bend, and you hear a yipe, and that's it. And so they're not accustomed to the fact that this is not downtown Kenosha. This is the wilds of Chequamegon, and there are things out here that can make your day a little sour. So those are those kinds of things that just happen because there are wolves on the landscape. Hunting hound risks are very real. Um, the bear training season, which is July and August, is when about 66% of the hounds that are killed by wolves each year are killed. It's not the majority during the hunt itself in September, October. It's the training period. And there's a reason for that. It's because these dogs are running bear during the time precisely when those pups are at maximum growth phase on those rendezvous sites. And there are adults that are babysitting those animals. And of course, the adult wolves react to the presence of a pack of dogs coming in as a potential threat. So in most cases, that's where the clash occurs. And this is one of those areas politically that's just really messy because you can't change the behavior of the wolves. If wolves are on the landscape and you've got hounds loose, this is going to be a consequence of those kinds of activities. But in any event, it's real, and the majority of dogs that are killed each year by wolves are the hunting hounds. Well, let's talk about deer. Good studies have been done in both Michigan and Wisconsin. I'm just going to pull up the Wisconsin one. So it was done in about 2009, I believe, to about 2012, coordinated between the Wisconsin DNR and the University of Wisconsin. Two different sites out near Green Bay and then up in Winter, Wisconsin. And so the east central area and the north, they applied the same exact techniques of radio collaring does and radio collaring fawns, and then looking at what killed them. And I won't go into the details of how they did that, but in any event, you can see that there's a pretty profound difference with regards to adult does. And wolves are not present in the Green Bay area, and they did take a number of does in the North Country, but take a look at the difference between what the wolves are taking and what humans are taking. And so, again, this can be time specific. Things change, things go up and down, but in any event, up there at that time period, it was humans that were the predominant mortality source for does. Take a look now at those fawns. This is absolutely fascinating. Down there in that lower graph, um, take a look at East Central, which is EC, and the North Country. And keep in mind, in the North Country, there are wolf packs. Do you see the word wolf in there? No. The reason why is because bears, coyotes, and bobcats exist in much higher densities than do wolves. And as a consequence, during that time period when fawns are vulnerable, which is specifically June and July, these animals are not stupid. They're looking for a meal and they find them opportunistically and they take advantage of it. But because of the numbers of bear mouths, coyote mouths, and bobcat mouths, as opposed to wolf mouths, they take the lion's share of fawns in those geographic areas. And so this was something that, to a lot of us biologists, was rather surprising. But when you factor in the density, if you place that in the fray, it makes sense. So these dynamics, you guys, are very, very complex, and they change constantly. So can't pretend that we know everything. We never will. But in any event, we've got a pretty decent handle on it. We're going to talk about public safety then too. We had a state congressman that just recently said that we probably have to be worried about wolves in Ely. He probably neglected a nice little Oshkosh newspaper article printed back in about somewhere in the late 90s. Beautiful picture of a timber wolf standing in a downtown Oshkosh park in a snowstorm. Um, I can assure you that no kids in that park were killed. Nobody's been hurt up in Ely. But we need to look at this. I mean, wolves are large predators. They are evolved to take down animals larger than themselves. And I hate to tell you this, if we don't have guns, we're wimps out there. And so let's take a look at it. Um, Wolves don't factor into this at all. In terms of United States of America, the ranking of highest cause of death to humans is what you see here. And wolves are just zero. That doesn't mean they can't do it. I've been involved in my career with actually taking out wolves, lethally removing wolves in a number of instances where they were bold and they were encountering humans in an uncomfortable situation. And it was just time to say, okay, these animals have to go. And so that's where public safety is involved with regards to wolf management, is making assessment by professionals in concert with the citizens that are experiencing these unpleasantries, and making a decision as to what needs to be done. And so, are they a threat? Maybe at the photocopy machine in the office, but probably not anywhere else. I've never felt threatened by wolves. I've handled hundreds of them. My girls, who are now in their 40s, used to go out with me howling. We've had wolves walk right up to us while howling in the black and night, never carried flashlights. And um, yeah, I mean, we're still alive. Not to say that it can't happen, but in terms of the risk, it's pretty minimal. It's not something that we really need to be terribly concerned about. So let's talk about the legal status and how we manage these animals. If they're federally or state endangered, in terms of conflict management, we can only compensate and we can only get some non-lethal stuff going. Fladry, which is fencing that has tape on it, guard dogs, things like that. Threatened, same thing. But if there's no federal or state endangerment on it, then in Wisconsin, according to their plan, not only can we do compensation and non-lethal, but we can do lethal control. And as well, we have a program to allow landowners to get a shoot permit. And so that gives the onus back to the landowner, the citizen, to manage their own lands. Um, if they're not federally endangered or state endangered as well, we have a mandated state legislature regulated harvest of wolves. So during the time periods in the last 20 years when we had the ability to write out those shooting permits, this is what they took. And this is also lethal control by our own agents during these time periods. And so you can see, we're pretty serious about taking wolves that are misbehaving. And I mean, as in I'm retired, but I mean the DNR. They're, they have the ability. When they have the ability, they react to it. All right, I'm actually done. Aren't you lucky? Um, so I want to conclude by saying that, where wolves occur, they are very resilient. They're capable of absorbing some pretty decent mortality rates. They prey on deer. Males and females stay together. So these are takeaways for you. This is what wolves are. This is what they do. The males and the females cooperatively rear young. And they typically will stay together, not always, but they'll stay together for years until one or the other of the pair is dead, and then a disperser will come in and just slip into the position. They're very, very, very territorial. They are capable of dispersing in many cases long distances, and in actuality, they can actually live in human-dominated landscapes. It's us that choose not to live with them. Um, and when I was making this program up, I was listening to Sirius FM, and Rolling Stones' 1968 song came on, Sympathy for the Devil. And wolves, in some cases, are the devil. And so I say, predation is the way of making a living. It ain't easy. So have some sympathy for that devil. Thank you very much. Turn it back over to you guys.
Thank you very much. I always say I get the first question, so I wanted you to talk about habituation to human beings a little bit because I've experienced that myself, and how bad that it is. I mean, there was a spot in Black River Falls where the wolves were getting food from passerbys and cars and got habituated, and why that's such a bad thing.
Was that in the late 90s, early 2000s?
It was.
Boy, let me tell you, I was the guy involved in all of that. So yes, I'm very well aware of that. Habituation, there's two different stages of as wolves behaviorally creep closer and closer to that, we need to do something. First is habituation, where they just lose their fear of people, but they're not, looking at people like prey. And then there's bold things where they actually up the ante a bit and they start taking things from people, like a mitten. Or in that one case out there, Tom, I had a report which I could never verify of a guy that pulled over on Highway 54, and it was just after the deer season. The guy was hauling rolled up deer hides in his pickup truck to a fur buyer, and the wolf actually jumped in the flatbed of his truck. And I never was able to verify because we couldn't find the guy, but we had second source people that saw this. And I can't say that it happened, but I can't say that it didn't happen. And it doesn't surprise me based on what I know about those animals that were there at that time. Um, Tragically, most of those animals were hit by cars, and that resolved the issue. And there was one other animal that we have a pretty good history on, but in any event, when they transition from with habituation, you have opportunities to scare them and get that fear back to them. And then when it gets to bold behavior, that's when you have to you have to intervene. That's it. And so that is when, like for instance, there was a pack near there, Tom, that I had to intervene because they were bold, and it was just enough. I just had enough with that, and so we took 6 out of the 9 animals out, and that included pups. In the middle of summer. Not a pleasant thing to do, but it was a necessary thing to do. And so I can also tell you, Tom, though, that people misinterpret behaviors of wolves. I'll give you a really good example of right there in the Central Forest, just south of 54 on Highway 173, out of Warrens and over towards Mather, where I had a yearling female wolf and yearlings tend to be naive, really, in some cases, naive. Keep in mind, there are personalities with wolves, and there are some that are, aggressive and some that are very timid. And there are animals that are naive, and you can have a blend of naivete with aggressiveness and with timidity. But in any event, this animal, I got a call from a guy, and he said, I got a report of sick wolf. I said, well, what's the problem? He says, well, this wolf was walking down 173 right on the yellow line. And to me, that was like, well, wolves walk down highways once in a while, so that's not indicative of it being sick. It might be indicative of it being very uncautious, but in any event, I said, okay, fine. What else was the behavior? And that was about it. And so 2 weeks later, I get a call again, same animal, and it was collared, and I knew who it was, and same behavior. And I thought, okay. So one day I'm driving to work, and here's that wolf on a different highway, and it walks. I pulled right over, and it walked right by me, and it was a hot day in July, and I looked at it And I mean, it was a hot day and my windows rolled down at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm looking at it, it's 2 feet away from me as it walked by me. And I literally, this is a stupid wolf biologist for you. I said, get off the road, you're going to get hit. And Wolf looked at me, walked by, stood about 25 yards behind my car. I got out and I walked towards it and I said, get off the road, you're going to get hit. And the wolf cocked its head, walked off the road, and that was the end of that occasion. Um, and of course, I knew what I was doing because I knew that animal was a yearling, and I knew this was one of these naive guys that just hasn't got a clue. And that kind of behavior can be misconstrued as being either, you know, uh, getting bold or habituated or something like that, or even in this case, sick. And it was nothing. It was just a teenage wolf that was doing something stupid. And I've seen that before, and I've seen it after. Sometimes, in this case, that animal got killed just before the deer season. But in other cases, I've seen them just mature, and that's the end of it. And other wolf biologists have documented this very thoroughly. So, yeah, that can be uncomfortable if you're one of those that has a wolf that does that. What I tell people is a couple things. Number one, if you are uncomfortable with any wild animal, you need to be able to figure out an escape route without panicking. And each species is different, but um, moose on Isle Royal where I'm backpacking, and I have backpacked up there a lot. Drop the backpack and climb a tree, because they're 6, 8 feet tall, and you're not going to outrun them. So back in my younger days, I could do that, and I did it. But with regards to wolves, that's another good idea. Climb a tree because they can't climb trees, and you stand your ground. Don't ever look at them in the eyes, but you walk kind of diagonally away and do a loop around while watching them out of the corner of your eye and make an exit. And that's great. Where we have a lot of problems, Tom, though, is with turkey hunters and deer hunters because they're clucking at a decoy and they're all camouflaged. And the wolves, they know what turkeys are. And the bow hunters typically are going to douse themselves with buck scent or with doe scent, and in archery season, they're also camoed. And you wouldn't believe the stories I've heard from some of these. And they're harrowing, but in all cases, they've all escaped with their lives and they live to see it another day. That says well for the wolves because I've had some guys that tell me they've walked within 10 feet of them before they figured out, oh, geez, this is a human and gotten out of there. So it speaks well to the behavior of the wolves when they suddenly realize it's a human, but it can be a very um, harrowing experience, and you usually need to change your underwear when you get home. So that's just the way it is.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to Becky to ask some questions in the chat or answers. So go ahead, Becky.
Sounds good. Thanks, Tom. Well, if Tom gets the first question, I get the second one. I'm just curious because also besides being a Forest History Association member, I'm a member of the media, so I get this question a lot, and it's one that I've never been able to, I guess, fully answer for people. I know, like people will say, well, wolves will, take deer that are sick or that sort of thing, and maybe they have an influence on CWD. And people have asked me, well, do the CWD prions, can they go through the digestive system of a wolf and be put somewhere else on the landscape? And I haven't found any studies that have looked at that. I've seen, like birds and that sort of stuff, but never wolves. Is there anything out there that says one
No,
way or
there
the other? Or?
not yet.
Okay.
There are some studies going on. The CWD is approaching Yellowstone right now, and the biologists out there are certainly waiting for it, if you will. So they're getting geared up to study those kinds of things. That's the only place I know of where it's closing in to where there are wolves. In Wisconsin, it's going to ultimately happen. I mean, we're getting spots of CWD here in the Central Forest, and there are wolves here. Um, I can only lean on, I think there have been one or two studies that I have seen with regards to mountain lions in Colorado, which is endemic to CWD. And I think that so far, from what I have seen, the mountain lions have not gotten sick with it, but I don't know whether they're passing it on through the digestive system. You have to keep in mind, and it's really hard for people to get a handle on this, that CWD is not alive. It's a
Right.
protein, it's a molecule which does all of this incredible damage neurologically and ultimately kills the ungulate. And so it's also very tolerant environmentally. So extremes of temperature don't seem to break down the molecule like a lot of molecules do. So the question really is it goes through the digestive tract of a predator, which has a lot of acids and all that good stuff. Um, would it break down? And I really can't answer that, but I'm sure there's people that are looking into it. So I'm sorry, Becky, I'm just not knowledgeable about it. But in any event, the jury's out on it. I know there are people that are going to be ecologically looking at this as soon as that overlap occurs, and certainly there's probably university studies going on that could answer that, if not already.
Okay. I see James has actually said in the chat that there's a gentleman working on his PhD in medicine that's looking at that very question. So
Excellent,
maybe we'll
excellent.
have that answer soon.
Boy, that'd be great.
And Mary had and I thought this too when you were talking about she had said for hours on end, wow, when you were talking about how fast a wolf can move and for how long. Normally you think of, a wild animal just going in real short bursts, but interesting that they can keep that pace up for a long time.
Yeah, this is an animal that is in it. They're just physically, they're just stellar. I mean, they got everything going for them. It's just that they evolved to focus on things that can beat them up. And that's animals that are
Right?
larger than themselves, and they do get beat up. In fact, it's interesting with Twin down here, Timberwolf Information Network. We census wolves here. We keep a census going. We've got trail cams out. And I was just reviewing some trail cam stuff, and we've got a pack up to the north here, and one of the packs that I've got cameras out in. And the chance of you seeing a wolf limping is pretty slim, but there's a pack up to the north of here and off to the east of where I live, where in each pack we've got a wolf limping, and normally what happens is they get kicked. They may even get stepped on by a deer or something, and so they're walking around limping for a little bit, and then they usually heal up. But that also suggests to me that even deer, I mean, the tally is that they get beat up when they're doing this stuff, and pulling down an animal with your teeth that's fighting back is very challenging, and you have to know that these wolves are getting beat up doing it, and there are long-term consequences for that. So yeah, and then I got to tell you too, endurance-wise, I was working with a biologist up in the Yukon, Bob Hayes, who unfortunately has passed away back in the early '90s, and working with him, flying over mostly tundra and some spruce stuff, and watching a pack of wolves we were trying to capture with a helicopter, um, going plowing through 2 feet of snow, and those guys were running for about a mile when we got to a part where they were open enough where we could come down low and dart them. And then when the lead animal was darted, he was like, yikes. And he took off like a shot. We went back up and just let him, because you don't want to harass him. You want that drug to take effect. And that animal ran for another 2 miles in that snow all by himself, and finally did a nose plant because, of course, the drug took effect. But I was just couldn't believe it. I think that guy was booking at about 20, 25 miles an hour for about 3 miles. And I
Oh
think
wow.
he could have gone longer if the drug hadn't been in him.
Sure.
So that's an amazing animal. It's an absolutely amazing animal.
And then we have another question here. You've kind of covered this, but maybe if there's anything else. Elizabeth had asked, what should someone do if they encounter a wolf?
Feel the privilege. Usually if that wolf's allowing you to see it. I had an occasion up in our land in the Upper Peninsula. Um, we were walking with our little dog, and it was snowing, and it was just first snow. And all of a sudden, we start seeing ravens, which usually indicates a kill nearby. And it was snowing like crazy. And I was with a friend of ours who's from California, and my wife and this guy and I, and we saw the ravens. And I said, "Have you ever been on a wolf kill before?" And he says, "No." I said, "Oh." And Deb said, I'll take the dog back now, so she turned around and started going back. And so we're walking in. I said, the ravens are really, really good with eyesight. I said, when they go down below that hill, we move towards it. When they start peering, we stop. It's frozen. So we're doing that. And this guy had never seen a wolf before. And it's snowing like crazy. And we paused because here come the ravens up over the hill, and there's a bunch of them. There's all a mass of them. And all of a sudden, and I'm looking at the ravens, and he says, is that a wolf over there? And I turned my head real slowly so I wouldn't bother the ravens. And I look, and here's a timber wolf standing about maybe 50 yards away. And it was just very slowly trotting by. And as it was trotting by, it just looked at us and kept on going. And that was it. I mean, it lasted 10 seconds maybe, and that was it. But that guy had the privilege of his life because he'd never seen, a wolf before. And I said, man, you were lucky because this is about the sixth or seventh time in my career in the forested environments in which I work where I've actually seen something like that, where it wasn't my doing, where I have radios on and, that kind of stuff. And so that's cool. And again, assess the situation. If you feel uncomfortable, then you need to back away, but back away slowly and with actually with dignity too. Don't go running or anything, just back away. They'll usually give you space. Incidentally, during the summer months on those rendezvous sites, wolves never bark, with only one exception, and that is when they feel threatened. And that bark is the harshest bark I've ever heard. German Shepherds can't match them for anything. But if I've had a couple occasions where, because of what I was doing, where you're kind of getting into a rendezvous site, and all of a sudden you hear this bark, and it is a bark that transcends the species because, oh yeah, I'm too close. The message was really clear. I've got to get out of here. And I've had that happen several times, and I'm still alive. But in any event, too close, then that bark is amazing, and you need to back off. You just back off.
Okay. Tom had put this in the chat, and it's kind of along the same lines, but he said we had one question by email. It says Mike rides his bike in rural Washburn County and does on occasion see wolves in low light conditions. He wonders if he should be concerned or if there's anything he should do if he encounters a wolf. Is there any, like, say you're riding your bike through somewhere, is there any like bigger chance it might chase you, try to figure out what you are, or
Yeah, I mean, I would, if it was me, I would get off the bike and I would start
no?
walking. And the reason for that is the animal might misinterpret you as something that is trying to flee. And that is a pursuit signal for wolves. And if they have misidentified what you are, you might get a closer encounter than you really want. And especially dawn dusk, where light conditions are different, especially difficult for us humans, even a little bit for wolves, but not as bad because they can see nighttime pretty decently. Um, I would just exercise caution. I mean, it's somewhat about living with wild animals in your neighborhood. It doesn't matter what it is, bears, wolves, whatever, is you have to be adaptable yourself. You have to change your behavior sometimes. I mean, it's only being respectful. And so, if it was me, I probably wouldn't be riding at dawn dusk. I might, especially if I knew there were wolves in the area, I might either walk or I might just wait another hour or two when it's lighter out. Because wolves do operate pretty decently at dawn dusk. They can be active all day long, any time of day, but because it's so populated in Wisconsin, they tend to be more nocturnal than they are diurnal. And so one suggestion I would have is, and it may be a pain in the butt for you, but change or alter your behavior just a tad, especially if you know they're in the area. Because keep in mind, they've got such huge territories that they're not going to be in one spot forever, but you've got to be able, if you're okay, are there tracks, are there droppings here? They're probably around. All of a sudden, if they're gone for a while, then you can figure that you're probably okay.
Okay. So Tom, that last one that's in there, is that yours? Did you want to ask that question? You're on mute, Tom.
I noticed that your email moniker is Old Two Toes, and I think I know the story a little bit. but maybe you'd want to tell the rest of the group here who Old Two Toes was.
Well, some of you might know that my first book was a history of how we wiped out wolves in Wisconsin. And I spent 20 years doing the research, and I started as a teenager. Didn't think it was going to be a book. But Old Two Toes was the dominant male in what was known as the Willow Wolf Pack in the 1940s. And it was the bounty period. And they, the bounty guys, I interviewed a lot of the bounty people, the bounty guys. And a lot of them actually, in the 1970s, exercised remorse over what they accomplished. They wiped out wolves. But Old Two Toes got his name by the biologists that were studying deer in that area. And tangentially, they were starting to keep notes on what few wolves were around. This animal was marked because he had stepped into a trap and popped some toes off. And he kept encountering traps and kept popping toes off, so that I believe 3 out of the 4 paws had toes missing at the end. And I wrote a neat story. You can get the book at International Wolf Center. It's called Wild Wolves We Have Known, which is a book that I edited, collecting stories from all the wolf biologists around Europe, Canada, Alaska, and the United States, the current day wolf biologists, about their favorite wild wolf. And so there's a collage of really neat stories. There's 23 stories and 31 authors, but I decided, since I was the editor, I'm going to write about Old Two Toes. And so you have to pick up the book to find the rest of the story. But as you well know, by the end of the bounty era, there were no wolves left. But this guy was incredibly maimed, and the biologist couldn't even figure out how he could keep up on crusted snow because he just had pig legs. So Old Two Toes. The reason why I have it as a Gmail is, when you put your name into Gmail when you're creating those accounts 30 years ago, your name goes in, Dick 135,225 at Gmail. And I thought, I'll bet you nobody has Old Two Toes. And I guessed right.
So, Becky, I see there's one question in the Q&A, but before you do that, I just want to remind everybody that you'll get a survey, and we'll give Dick some feedback on his program. I'm sure it's pretty good, but we always aim to improve. So if you have suggestions for us, please do answer the survey. And Becky, you can finish off with the last question.
Sounds good. The last question is from Thomas. He said, can you comment on the flora that a wolf might consume?
Flora?
Like what kind of plants would a wolf consume if it had to go to that?
Well, they do go to it. And it's usually in the months of late July into August. And it's not every wolf, and it's not every year. And it varies geographically, but blueberries are big. I've seen them eat, when they're available, choke cherries or black cherries as they're falling out of the trees. They'll snarf those guys up. I would bet you 10 to 1 wild cranberries on occasion. They are known to eat apples, and probably therefore crab apples. A lot of the settlers scattered across the North Country, those old farmsteads, in most cases, are now almost entirely gone. 50 years ago, I could find them. Now I can't, but because they're just gone. But there still are, every once in a while when you're walking, you find an apple tree out in the middle of the woods. And so they're opportunistic animals. They're going to eat. If they're hungry and they can't get what they really want, they're probably going to settle for something else. And they've got a digestive system like a dog. In other words, they can eat a lot of stuff and pull nutrients out of it. And so they're remarkable that way as well. So, but in terms of, it's usually very seasonal. It tends to be late July into August when those types of crops, if you will, are abundant, and that's about it.
All
Okay,
right.
excellent.
I think we've finished all the questions, so we'll call it a night. Thank you very much. It's been nice to reconnect with you. Dick and I worked at the DNR for many years, and we ran across each other's paths quite often, but it was nice to see him tonight.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening and fill out the survey for us.
Thank you,
Well, thank
everyone.
you guys. Take care. Have a good evening. Thank you.